The rain fell in regular, gentle sheets, leaving a slippery, glittering layer on the ground. Officer Luke Callahan glanced at his partner, Shadow, as he adjusted his tactical vest inside a stopped police cruiser on a lonely street. The German shepherd sat up straight in the passenger seat, looking around with sharp eyes. Together, they had answered innumerable calls, but this one felt different. Luke couldn't help but notice the dispatcher's voice, which carried a feeling of urgency that made him feel uneasy. Unit 12, there have been reports of questionable activities in the former Western Drive facility. Potential presence of armed persons. Be careful as you go. The radio crackled, backup is on its way. Luke let out a long breath and reached out to pat Shadow's head. For now, it's just us, buddy. Remain alert. Shadow's whole body tensed and prepared, he made a low, approving sound. With its rusted doors and peeling walls, the warehouse towered like silent giants against the dark sky. Above, raindrops trickled from broken tiles, and the eerie sound of plinking reverberated through the night. With his weapon pulled and his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, Luke proceeded with caution. Shadow followed along him, sniffing the humid air, his ears perking up at every sound he heard in the distance. Luke suddenly froze. Quick but muted footsteps reverberated softly from inside the building. He raised his fist and told Shadow to stop. The ensuing hush was deafening. Then it took place. Something fell and rolled over the concrete floor with a harsh, metallic clatter. Luke's left side erupted in a burning ache before he could fully comprehend the sound. He stumbled backward, struggling to keep his head up while his vision flickered. His hand automatically moved to his side, and it was covered in blood when he withdrew it. The world spun around him as he fell to the damp ground, knees buckling. Shadow remained still. Beside his slain companion, the dog stood motionless, staring into the darkness. 3 individuals then appeared, silhouetted against the dim light leaking from a far-off street lamp. While the other 2 murmured to one another in low, menacing whispers, one of them had something in his hand. Luke's voice was a weak rasp as he attempted to communicate. Shadow did not flinch, but the shepherd did. He growled loud and guttural, a warning he was prepared to defend at all costs. Shadow faced the 3 men by himself as Luke's strength diminished. The devoted dog's subsequent actions would not only alter the evening's trajectory but also demonstrate the unbreakable bond between a police officer and his partner. Shadow refused to back down as the rain continued to pour, pounding on the sidewalk. His ears were pushed back in focus, and his paws were firm on the slippery surface. Only a few steps away, Luke lay with faint breathing and a blood stain on his clothing that grew bigger by the second. His power was rapidly ebbing away as he attempted to raise his head to see what was going on. All he could hear was Shadow's deep, steady growl, a sound that was equal parts warning and unflinching resolve. With their boots splattering in the puddles, the figures approached and looked at each other uncertainly. One of them whispered, "It's just a dog," but his voice was doubtful. Shadow's posture lowered defensively, as if he were about to spring, and his snarl grew at the words. As the rain persisted and the tension became nearly intolerable, his gaze shifted between the men, taking in each twitch and movement. First to move, one of the men took cautious, methodical steps in Shadow's direction. In an act of pretended assurance, his hand extended, but his hesitancy was clear. Shadow didn't back down. Rather, he remained where he was, watching the man's every action with keen eyes. After a little delay, the man glanced over his shoulder. "We don't have time for this. Grab the cop and let's go." When Luke heard this, he gathered all his strength. His hand shook when it touched the damp floor as he attempted to get his radio. He said, "Shadow," in a barely audible whisper, but the dog's ears perked up at the mention of his name. They had always shared an unspoken bond based on loyalty, trust, and an unbreakable bond. Shadow growled louder, as though in answer to Luke's silent entreaty. Shadow's uncompromising position obviously worried the men, as they paused. A single one pointed to the others. Ignore it. Come on. However, the sound of sirens in the distance cut through the damp calm before they could move. Even if it was dim, it was sufficient. With time running out, the men's plan was falling apart as they looked at each other frantically. Shadow remained motionless as the figures fled into the night, making sure they were gone before focusing entirely on Luke. His damp fur brushed Luke's arm as he hurried to his partner's side. Even though he was exhausted, Luke forced a small smile as he fumbled for Shadow's neck. The sirens increased in volume, indicating that assistance was at last approaching. With his unspoken assurance, Shadow stayed by Luke's side. No matter what, he would stay. The arrival of backup would bring help, but Shadow's actions that night would leave an impression no one would soon forget. What happened next would strengthen the link between a man and his dog, a bond born in loyalty and bravery. The flashing lights of the backup units finally cut through the darkness, their red and blue beams bouncing across the rain-soaked pavement. Officers spilled out of their vehicles, arms drawn, scouring the area for threats. Shadow stayed protectively close to Luke. His fur matted with rain, but his eyes still bright and vigilant. He snarled low at the sight of strangers approaching, his allegiance unshaken despite his tiredness. One of the first responders, Officer Down, hurried to Luke's side and spoke onto his radio. With gloved hands, the officer quickly assessed the wound while kneeling. "Come on, Callahan," he said. For a split second, Luke's eyes opened, and he looked straight at Shadow. He made an effort to communicate despite his weakness. "Shadow," he said, "saved me," his voice scarcely audible above the din. Shadow grudgingly took a step back as paramedics came, pressing his ears to his head while they attempted to stabilize Luke. An officer, Officer Noah, crouched near Shadow, speaking softly. "We have him now, so it's all right, boy." Shadow, however, didn't go very far. His gaze remained fixed on Luke, observing every action as though he recognized the seriousness of the circumstance. The paramedics moved swiftly, placing Luke onto a stretcher and applied pressure to his wound. As they placed him into the ambulance, one of them remarked, "He's critical, but he's got a chance." With his paws raking the slippery metal, Shadow attempted to dive in after them but was gently restrained by an officer. "Shadow, it's easy. Now he's in capable hands." Shadow whined softly, pacing anxiously as the ambulance drew away with Luke inside. The other officers remained on high alert, fanning out to search the area for the suspects. Noah's voice was steady but tense as he said, "They couldn't have gotten far." He looked at Shadow, who remained agitated, his keen intuition obviously recognizing the unresolved threat. Another cop came up to Shadow on a leash as the minutes passed in the hopes of soothing him. However, Shadow's ears perked up and he froze before the leash could be fastened. He heard a slight sound, the crunch of gravel beneath his feet. Shadow had noticed it before the officers did. His body turned toward the darkness, and he gave a low, urgent bark. Noah's eyes followed the dog's lead, his hand instinctively going to his holstered weapon. "What is it, Shadow?" he asked. The dog's reaction left little question, the danger wasn't finished yet. The tension in the air increased as the officers got ready to follow Shadow's example. They would have to confront the danger Luke narrowly avoided, whatever Shadow had sensed in the darkness. Shadow's bark sliced through the damp night air, and the officers looked at each other tensely. He stood erect, his ears pressed forward, his eyes focused on the pitch-black space outside the warehouse. With one hand on his holstered weapon, Officer Noah gripped his flashlight tighter. With a steady but low voice, he told the others to spread out but remain vigilant. "We must have faith in Shadow if he is right." Shadow tracked upward, his nose low to the ground as he made his cautious way toward the lot's edge. His clothing was slicked by the rain, but he moved with purpose and accuracy. Noah trailed closely after, his torch beam piercing the fog. Nerves tense, the group pushed forward, the gravel crunching under their boots. Every sound seemed to be accentuated by the surrounding silence, and every shadow appeared to change. One cop called from close to the warehouse's side, "Have something over here." With his tail straight like a flag indicating focus, Shadow rushed forward as his head snapped toward the voice. Noah and the others followed quickly, their adrenaline spiking as they reached a partially open door. The faint glow of a flashlight revealed footprints in the mud leading inside. Noah signaled for silence, beckoning for the team to fan out. Shadow was the first to step through the door, his paws landing silently on the concrete floor. The interior of the warehouse was gloomy, the air thick with the stench of oil and mildew. Shadow's actions were careful but determined, his nose working overtime as he followed the scent trail further into the shadows. Then, a noise faint but unmistakable, a tussle of feet, a mumbled curse. Noah lifted his hand, signaling the players to stop. Shadow froze in position, his ears twitching as he honed in on the source. The anxiety was evident, every second stretching out as they waited for something, anything to happen. Abruptly, a man ran toward the far exit from behind a pile of crates. Noah's voice reverberated across the empty room as he yelled, "Stop, police!" Without hesitation, Shadow sped up and chased after the suspect, reducing the distance in a matter of seconds with his strong steps. The guy glanced over his shoulder, terror flashing across his face as he realized he couldn't outrun the determined K-9. As Shadow closed near on the fleeing culprit, the police prepared to intercept. What transpired next would reveal exactly how crucial the link between man and dog may be in the face of danger. As Shadow closed down on the escaping suspect, the sound of pounding footsteps reverberated throughout the enormous warehouse. The man was clearly in a panic, as evidenced by his labored breathing and frantic looks over his shoulder. Shadow pursued his aim with unrelenting strides, his body low and sleek. Officer Noah and the rest of the crew followed quickly behind him, shouting for the man to stop, but Shadow was in the lead. After arriving at the distant exit, the suspect yanked at the door, but it jammed in the middle and scraped noisily against the concrete. Shadow only needed the delay. His authoritative bark filled the air like a warning, and he was on the man's heels with a single, strong leap. The guy froze, raising his hands reflexively as though giving up would appease the resolute K-9. Shadow remained resolute, his keen eyes fixed on the man as he growled softly. A few seconds later, Noah and the other officers arrived with their weapons out. "Don't move," Noah said in a firm, piercing voice. As the officers moved in to secure him, the suspect fell to his knees with his hands still up. Shadow stayed where he was, his roar fading a little but his concentration unwavering. Shadow didn't take a step back until Noah used shackles to clip the man's wrists, ending his work for the time being. As the officers began to question the suspect, another sound caught Shadow's attention, a slight rustle coming from deeper inside the warehouse. His head jerked abruptly toward the sound, and his ears pricked up. Noah saw right away. "Shadow, what is it?" The dog didn't wait for a command when he asked. He began moving, his pace quick and deliberate. Shadow led the rest of the team toward the far end of the building, and Noah gave them a signal. The air grew cooler, the low buzz of machinery blending with the sound of trickling water from the leaky roof. They reached an ancient storage room, the door slightly ajar. Shadow stopped just outside, sniffing deeply. He took a step back, gave Noah a low bark, and seemed to be telling the people to move on. With their beams cutting through the darkness, the police cautiously opened the door. Inside, they discovered the second suspect holding a homemade weapon while crouching behind a pile of damaged pallets. One cop yelled, "Hands where we can see them." After a brief moment of hesitation, the man raised his hands in defeat and dropped the thing with a clatter. As the officers moved in to detain him, Shadow stood nearby, watching intently. Even after two suspects were in custody, his posture remained alert. His body language conveyed to the squad that the evening was far from over. Shadow's intuition had already been beneficial, but as the team was preparing to depart, the devoted K-9 sensed that something was still amiss, a finding that would expose a more serious danger. Despite the arrest of 2 individuals, the atmosphere remained tense. The police learned everything they needed to know from Shadow's body language. This was not the end of it. His keen eyes scanned the warehouse, and his ears perked up at the slightest noise. Beside him, Officer Noah knelt down and spoke quietly. "Boy, what is it? I'm sure you have something." Shadow turned his head toward the loading area at the back of the warehouse, which was dark, and gave a low, resolute bark. Noah communicated to the team, "Stay sharp. Shadow's on to something." With their flashlights shining on the rusting machinery and trash that littered the area, the police advanced cautiously. Shadow took the lead, tracking a scent that seemed to get stronger with each step, his nose low to the earth. Even though the rain had stopped outside, the warehouse roof was still dripping, each drop resonating menacingly in the silence. Shadow halted suddenly as they got closer to the loading dock, his body rigid. His throat gave a low growl, and he fixed his gaze on a big metal container that was pressed up against the distant wall. The lid of the corroded and dented container was slightly open. The officers looked at each other suspiciously. One of them whispered, clutching his torch more tightly, "That doesn't feel right." With his weapon out, Noah took a cautious step forward. He told the others to cover me. He carefully pushed the lid open wider with the tip of his flashlight. He discovered a small stash of guns and a bag with what looked like cash and identification documents inside, which made him sick to his stomach. He stepped back to give the others a chance to observe, muttering, "Looks like they were planning something bigger." The piercing creak of metal and the distinct sound of movement, however, came from above before anyone could comprehend the revelation. Shadow was the first to react, letting us a loud yelp and rushing in the direction of the noise. The cops glimpsed a third suspect sitting on a steel beam as they aimed their beams higher. Waiting for the right opportunity to strike, the man had been hidden. Noah yelled up there as the man sprang into motion, jumping down into a pile of crates to try to get away. Shadow was quicker. With a commanding bark, the dog blocked the suspect's route and stopped him before he could fully flee. The man paused, obviously spooked by the dog's aggression. With their rifles drawn, the police surrounded him as they closed in. The man's face was pallid with defeat as he slowly lifted his hands, realizing he had no way out. The officers believed that the night was finally over with all of the suspects in custody, but what they discovered in the secret stockpile would lead to a much larger reveal than they had expected. The tension in the warehouse started to subside once the third suspect was apprehended, but Shadow's attention to detail remained unwavering. Officer Noah looked down to see the dog still staring at the container they had just opened. "Boy, what else is there?" Crouching next to Shadow, he whispered. After taking another whiff of the air, the dog turned back to the container and barked softly but insistently. Noah and one of the officers looked at each other. Putting on gloves, he carefully removed the remaining contents from the container and remarked, "Let's take a closer look." His gut twisted as he discovered what he had. A battered and wet folder with papers and maps lay beneath the guns and money. He laid them out on a neighboring crate and examined them with his flashlight. The map's markings displayed several sites throughout the city, each ringed and marked with a date. Noah replied grimly, this wasn't just a robbery. They had considerably more ambitious plans. These are important points of infrastructure. This might have had disastrous consequences. As the police considered the ramifications in silence, the weight of the finding weighed heavily in the air. Sensing the uneasiness, Shadow growled again, as if he too realized how serious what they had discovered was. With a mix of defeat and rage on their faces, the arrested suspects were led out of the warehouse one by one. As he was shoved into the back of a squad car, the third man, the one who had been hiding on the beams, sneered. "Do you believe that this will stop anything?" His voice was full of disdain as he spat. Noah closed the car door without replying, but his jaw tensed. Shadow remained near Noah back in the warehouse while the other officers bagged the evidence. One cop nodded to Shadow and stated, "We might have just walked right past all of this if it weren't for him. How long would it have taken us to figure out what they were planning?" Noah stroked behind his ears while glancing down at Shadow. "He's not just a partner," Noah remarked quietly. "We're all leaving here tonight because of him." With the night's burden bearing down on him, Noah took one last look around the warehouse as they got ready to depart the scene. Shadow, who sat next to him, was still looking around, but his posture had relaxed. Noah's voice was full with appreciation as he replied, "You did good, buddy. You're fortunate to have Luke. All of us are." The squad collected up the evidence and started back to the station after taking one more look at the darkened warehouse. Being aware that Shadow had discovered a conspiracy that might have destroyed their city in addition to saving lives that evening. The complete extent of what the team had discovered started to take shape as they exited the warehouse. But the threat had not entirely passed. A fresh obstacle awaited, and Shadow would once more prove to be an indispensable hero. As the officers returned with the evidence and the suspects, the station had an odd sense of calm in the early morning. Inside, there was a sense of suspense as the crew started to piece together the entire breadth of the conspiracy they had discovered, even if the rain was still tapping against the windows. Now that the immediate threat had passed, Shadow walked next to Noah, his tail bobbing a little, but his sharp eyes never ceased taking in the bustle of activity all around him. In the briefing room of the station, the evidence was arranged on a long table. The images shown by the maps, documents, and weapons were terrifying. The maps circled areas weren't chosen at random. A power substation, important bridges, and even a hospital were among them. These locations would be busy during the dates, which coincided with forthcoming public events. Noah leaned over the table, his hands resting on the edge. "They were planning a concerted attack," he replied quietly, his voice husky. With a solemn attitude, Captain Morales walked into the room. "This is no longer merely a local issue. The federal authorities have already been notified. By noon, they will arrive to take over." She stopped and looked down at Noah's obediently sitting companion, Shadow. "Additionally, ensure that someone makes accommodations for this dog. We wouldn't have discovered any of this in time without him." With a slight smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, Noah nodded. He continued, lovingly caressing Shadow's neck, "He's the real hero tonight." Luke's condition, meanwhile, remained stable but critical. His first words were a question concerning Shadow, and the officers who had visited the hospital stated that he was weak but responsive. There was still work to be done, but Noah knew he had to see Luke soon. But Shadow felt as though he could sense something. He whimpered gently, like though he was missing his lover. Noah told the dog, "You'll see him soon." Now in different interrogation rooms, the suspects remained silent. When asked, one of them, the man who had sheltered on the warehouse beam, just grinned. "You're too late to stop everything," he remarked coolly, "but you stopped us tonight." His enigmatic remarks chilled the room. Noah remained calm despite clenching his fists. Shadow was standing close to the door when he looked at him. He cocked his head as if he could feel the strain too. The team worked non-stop as the hours passed, giving urgent updates to federal authorities and comparing the material with known associates of the accused. Each officer was aware that time was running out. The suspect's warning hung menacingly in the back of everyone's mind, but for the time being, they had thwarted one aspect of a risky scheme. Shadow remained beside Noah, reminding everyone that sometimes the most important guardian was not two-legged but four-legged. Shadow would once again be at the center of the team's task as they raced against the clock after a new lead surfaced just as they believed they had controlled the threat. When an analyst hurried into the briefing room with a freshly decoded piece of evidence in hand, the atmosphere in the station changed dramatically. She said, her voice shaking with urgency, "We missed something." She spread a map across the table, pointing to a location that hadn't been highlighted before, a cargo yard on the outskirts of town. A delivery was planned for this morning, according to one of the documents. If our theory is correct, they may have been preparing to transport weapons or explosives to a different area. Officer Noah's abdomen constricted. Now the cryptic threat from the suspect made apparent. The story continued. "What is our time limit?" he inquired. She looked at her watch, the analyst said. "Less than an hour, if the document's timing is correct." Noah turned to face Shadow, who was standing beside him, his ears pricked up as though he were about to move. Noah said forcefully, "Leave now." After gathering his team, he had them rushing toward the shipping yard while sirens were wailing within minutes. The huge cargo containers stood like monoliths in the bleak morning sky, and the yard was eerily quiet when they arrived. Shadow leaped down next to Noah as he got out of the car and looked around. As he guided the team to the center of the yard, the dog's nose got to work right away, sniffing the air. The officers moved in formation, their eyes darting between the towering stacks of containers, each step echoing ominously on the concrete ground. Shadow halted suddenly beside a clump of containers, his body stiff and his nose pushed to the earth. He shouted aggressively, instructing the team to focus on one particular container. Noah gestured for the officers to guard the area as he investigated the container. The lock had been broken, and the door was slightly ajar. Noah pulled it open gently, presenting a disturbing sight, containers stocked with components that might be used to construct explosives. They had discovered the cache barely in time. One of the officers positioned close shouted as the squad hurried to gather the evidence. "We've got movement." Two people fled from behind a pile of containers on the far side of the yard, trying to get away. Shadow made no hesitation. He sprang into action, closing the distance between himself and the escaping suspects with unparalleled speed. Shadow was obviously going to get there before Noah and the others did. After the suspects were surrounded and the cache was secured, the mission's last moments would put man and dog to the test and result in a memorable conclusion. Shadow charged forward, concentrating on the escaping suspects as they swerved among the shipping containers. The officers trailed closely after, their boots stomping on the damp concrete, but Shadow was obviously the fastest of them all. Sharp and forceful, his bark sounded as though to warn the suspects that there was nowhere else to flee. The two men realized they had underestimated the tenacious dog and looked back in panic. One of the suspects lost his balance on the slick surface. In a matter of seconds, Shadow was there, watching over him and barking to warn the police. As the officers stepped in to take him into custody, the man froze and raised his hands in surrender. The second suspect, however, continued. Desperate to make one final escape attempt, he ran toward a truck parked close to the yard's edge. Noah yelled, "Go, Shadow!" And the dog ran relentlessly in the direction of the truck. The suspect hopped into the cab and struggled with the keys, but Shadow jumped onto the running board and let out a loud bark before he could start the engine. The man dropped the keys in his fright after being startled by the sound. Shortly after, Noah and the other officers showed there, took the suspect out of the truck, and arrested him. The situation ultimately settled into an eerie silence, disturbed only by the sound of distant sirens as assistance arrived. As the suspects were led away, Noah crouched down beside Shadow, who was panting but attentive, his tail wagging gently. With joy in his voice, Noah added, "You did it, buddy. They were stopped by you." With their relationship stronger than ever, Shadow leaned into Noah's fingers while he stroked behind his ears. The officers guarded the explosive stockpile nearby, making sure the hazardous materials would never make it to their intended targets. Word had gotten out about Shadow's antics by the time they got back to the station. Officers came to welcome the returning team, giving their K-9 hero and the officers a pat on the back and applauding. Noah took Shadow to see Luke in the hospital later that day. Even though he was weak, Luke was able to smile when Shadow came in with his tail swinging wildly. Luke whispered, "You saved my life, boy," as he reached out to pet Shadow's fur. The dog nuzzled his lover softly, a subtle assurance that he would always protect him, no matter the threat. The mission was finished, the criminals captured, and the city safe, all because to the heroism of one outstanding K-9. Shadow's deeds would be regarded as both heroic and evidence of the inseparable relationship between a dog and a human.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.